Welcome to Mano a Mano, U.S. Puerto Rico, Journey Toward a More Perfect Union.
A podcast amplifying the voices of leaders, thinkers, activists, and allies from across the political spectrum who support Puerto Rico's fight for full democracy and self-determination.
I'm George Laws Garcia, Executive Director of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council.
And I'm Martín Rivera, Director of Advocacy.
On today's episode, we're going to be talking about an effort to develop a cross-territorial coalition seeking to address the democratic deficit faced by all residents of the U.S. territories.
We'll discuss the insular cases, their discriminatory impact, and how a coalition made up of residents from the territories are seeking to rectify the lack of democratic equality by advocating for change throughout the three branches of the federal government.
Additionally, we'll discuss the legislative proposal that seeks to finally resolve Puerto Rico's political status, the Puerto Rico Status Act, and why it's essential for federal elected officials to legislate to resolve the disparities faced by residents of the U.S. territories. Joining us for that conversation is Right to Democracy's co-founder and co-director, Adi Martínez-Román.
So let's get started.
Let's kick it off with news and updates. Could you please provide us an update on what's happening in Congress, the Puerto Rico Status Act, and maybe what's happening in Puerto Rico?
So right now, the biggest legislative priority is the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration reauthorization. The deadline is coming up this upcoming Friday, and this bill is important because it deals with several issues for aviation, such as improvements in aviation safety, enhances protections for passengers, invests protections for airline workers, and invests in airports and airport infrastructure overall. So that includes Puerto Rico's airport, making sure more safety measures are put in place. As we recall, a door flew off a Boeing airplane, so that's what the FAA is for. So that's why it's an important agency to make sure that passengers and commercial airliners meet the requirements that they need to make sure that passengers have the safety and the infrastructure that's needed for their travel needs.
And obviously for Puerto Rico, this is huge because as an island, all of our transportation to the U.S. mainland or anywhere else is either by water or by air. Mm-hmm. And again, Congress having huge legislative action on major legislation that impacts the core of the transportation that we rely on as territorial residents, but not having those residents actually have a direct say in that legislation because we don't have voting members in the House and we have no representation in the Senate, to me, underscores the inherent disenfranchisement of territorial inequality.
The Senate passed the bill last week, so it's now on the House's term to then send it to the president's desk. Hopefully, they'll send it by the end of the week, and hopefully that issue is resolved. But when it comes to the issue of inequality because of the territories, it's a great segue to the next issue on the Hill, which is the Puerto Rico Status Act. That bill has garnered additional co-sponsors both in the House and Senate since our last podcast. In the House, it earned the co-sponsorship of Representative Claudia Tini from New York, a Republican. And in the Senate, it gained 3 additional co-sponsors. Senator Kristen Gillibrand from New York, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and just today, Senator Jackie Rosen from Nevada. That brings the official total of senators supporting this bill to 27 senators. That includes the lead sponsor, Senator Martin Heinrich, and 26 other co-sponsors.
That's huge. That's huge. And I think what it shows is that this legislation continues to gain bipartisan support. A Republican representative from New York joining on the House bill, and then 3 senators adding on to the Senate bill. It's definitely astounding progress that shows that this is building momentum. Yeah. So let's switch things up now to talk a little bit about what else has recently been happening in Congress.
Well, a lot of that recent support, particularly in the Senate, has come because of actions by grassroots groups coming here out of their own dime and actually advocating for the equality of the citizens of Puerto Rico. Just recently, the extended delegation, which was created as part of the shadow delegation, had the toma de acción del Congreso, and Governor Pierluisi actually participated in those visits. And as I mentioned, Majority Leader Schumer joined this bill, and the reason why that's so significant is because a leader of any chambers, the speaker or majority leader, they don't usually sign up to legislation. They wait for it to come to the floor before they have any official action. They don't want to sway any legislation one way or the other. So it is so significant that Senate Majority Leader, after all these years speaking about his support for the people of Puerto Rico to finally resolve their status, has finally come on a binding offer of statehood for the citizens of Puerto Rico to finally vote on this issue once and for all.
I think that one of the things that's absolutely critical to highlight for our listeners is that the support of the Senate Majority Leader and the other fellow senators that recently joined the bill is actually the result of a combined effort that is going on, where the governor is taking action, his role as the top elected official representing the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico, and also as a former member of Congress because he served in the House for 8 years. And we have, obviously, the resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez, continuing to move things forward in the House and seek opportunities to advance legislation there, and getting some of her Republican colleagues to join the bill since she's a Republican, and that's really helpful. And then the really impressive part about it is to see this movement of citizen grassroots advocates that are part of this extended congressional delegation flying in from Puerto Rico, from Florida, from numerous parts across the country to come to D.C., to meet with congressional offices, to actually talk to the members that represent them and say, hey, we're voters. We care about this issue. This matters to us. You should join and get on board.
And another additional point of progress during following the visits was that Chairman of the Committee of Jurisdiction, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources, and the chairman is Chairman Joe Manchin, has actually agreed to hold a hearing on the Puerto Rico Status Act. So that is huge news, and that shows the progress and the success of the advocacy efforts, not just done by us, but through grassroots and also by elected officials on the island, such as Governor Pierluisi and Resident Commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon, to continue the pressure, because there's a multitude of issues that Congress has to deal with every day when it comes to national security, reauthorization of the FAA, that's why we have to continue the constant drumbeat of progress. And this just shows we're moving forward, not backwards.
Well, I'm excited for a couple of reasons. One is because the Statehood Council, along with other grassroots advocates, we wrote a letter to Joe Manchin about this issue last year, calling for hearings in the Senate. And it looks like, based on those efforts, the efforts that the grassroots groups have done with the D.C. fly-ins, the governor meeting with Senator Manchin, all of those things have kind of come together and piled up to open up the possibility that we're going to have a hearing on this issue in the Senate, and the hearing itself is going to be historic. There hasn't been a hearing on this issue in the United States Senate in over 11 years, and the hearing itself will serve as an opportunity to educate members of the Senate on both sides of the aisle about the importance of this issue, how it's been developing legislatively into this compromise bill as a way to, open the space for voters in Puerto Rico to choose their political future, and also why this is so important for America as a whole.
Right. And I think this is a good segue, because obviously federal issues in D.C. are common, but the issue of federal representation was on the island recently as well. Puerto Rico just held their presidential primaries for the Republican and Democratic candidates for the presidency.
And how did that go?
So former President Donald Trump ran unopposed. He gained 23 more delegates and obviously won that primary. On the other hand, President Biden also won his primary. He didn't go unopposed. He had current Representative Dean Phillips and author Marianne Williamson.
Yep.
But he took 98% of the vote, and he gained 55 delegates for an estimated 55 delegates for the DNC convention.
So, what I find fascinating about presidential primary is that, again, it highlights the disenfranchisement of the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico, because all the federal laws that we're subject to, ultimately, it's the president and the executive branch of the federal government that gets to decide how those laws are implemented on the island. Yet, as U.S. citizens, we can participate in the primaries for the presidency because they belong to the political parties at the national level, the Democratic and Republican parties, which obviously have their own Puerto Rico Democratic and Republican Party. But then when it comes to the actual election, in November, voters in Puerto Rico won't be able to cast a ballot for the president, and they don't have electoral college votes. So ultimately, even though we're impacted by who ends up being the next president of the United States, we don't actually have a full say and representation in making that choice, along with our fellow U.S. citizens nationwide.
Right. And this is a Democratic deficit. And I know we're months away from the general election. This is before any of the general election debates. any other issues that might come up from now till November. So it does rob in two levels the Puerto Rican residents the right to have their voice on who should be the next president.
And I think it also opens up the opportunity for us to talk about some other electoral issues that are going on right now. So in Puerto Rico, aside from the presidential primary, the other main federal election that's taking place, the only other federal election taking place, is for the position of resident commissioner, which is the non-voting member that serves in the U.S. House of Representatives on behalf of the people of Puerto Rico. And one of the issues that has come up among the candidates for resident commissioner on the island is an issue that's actually directly related to whether or not the territory should be changed from our current status, which is that of an unincorporated territory of the United States, into an incorporated territory, meaning that the Constitution would fully apply to the island and we'd be kind of on a path to statehood. So can you tell us a little bit about what this whole debate is about territorial unincorporation or incorporation and why that matters right now?
Yeah, so right now, Puerto Rico and the other 5 U.S. territories, which have residents living in them, because in total we have 14 territories. Most people don't know this, and there's only one incorporated territory, and that's an atoll, the Palmyra
Atoll.
It has nobody living on it.
In the middle of the Pacific.
And that's an incorporated territory. Puerto Rico and the 5 remaining territories are on an unincorporated territory, so the Constitution does not apply equally fully to those residents of the territories, and also they don't have access to the same federal services, the same programs, and the same benefits. So when it comes to the issue of incorporation, that's when you're still under the plenary power of Congress. You're a U.S. territory, but unlike in unincorporated territory status, you're no longer a possession of the United States. You are a part of the United States. So all the rights and privileges, federal benefits, services, and the Constitution applies fully. The one issue that does come up is that there is still a lack of representation. You still will have, under incorporated territory status, a non-voting member in the House, no representation at all in the Senate, and you have the inability to vote for president. It's kind of akin, and I know that D.C. is under another part of the U.S. Constitution, but it's akin to being D.C., which is you have all the rights and privileges, but unlike D.C., you don't have the right to vote for president because that took a constitutional amendment for the District of Columbia to actually have the 3 electoral votes that it currently has. The main issue, it is a path towards statehood, but it's not a necessary path. Puerto Rico could be admitted as a state directly from an unincorporated territory status. It's not a requirement for that transition. And lastly, one issue that we've always talked about is the consensus between that right now we have in Congress is that while Puerto Ricans have already voted in the last 3 local plebiscites, this final plebiscite proposed in the Puerto Rico Status Act, it's a binding offer of statehood and other options. So I feel that by going through incorporation, you're closing the door on those other alternatives and also on the consensus that's been achieved so far. Because once you're incorporated, there's no de-incorporation. You're part of the United States. You are not going to be the option of independence is closed at that point. So that's why it's interesting that some candidates have proposed it. Again, it's a potential path, but it's not a required path. And
yeah, I think one of the things that is really important for our listeners to understand is that this is one of those issues where it actually ends up dividing the statehood movement, because some people think that the only way that Puerto Rico is going to achieve statehood is if we achieve incorporation as a intermediate step in anticipation of statehood, so that all federal taxes and laws apply to the island and the Constitution fully applies to the island. The reality is that there's no constitutional requirement to be incorporated before being admitted as a state.
A good similarity is saying D.C., because D.C. has the same benefits, has the same rights. They just lack that essential democratic representation in the chambers that actually shape the laws that impact the citizens of those territories. And Congress also has power under Article 1, Section 8 over the way that D.C. administers its laws. They can actually, D.C. could pass their local ordinances, and then Congress can say, no, we reject that. So that's a way that it's akin, but again, the issue of the lack of representation, but you have all the responsibilities such as federal income tax. So again, taxation without representation under incorporated.
And that doesn't make sense for anyone. So I think one of the things that's super interesting about this is that this is a debate and a discussion which is kind of academic in some way, but it's made itself onto the political stage, and it's also now being echoed because of all the conversations surrounding the efforts to overturn the insular cases. So we talked about the insular cases in some of the previous episodes, and in this episode we get the opportunity to speak to an expert on the insular cases, which is Adi Martínez-Román.
What we say in Right to Democracy is that these cases establish this legal colonial framework that then creates this insidiousness. You feel it as paternalism, you feel it as feelings of superiority and of saying, these people don't know what they're doing, we're gonna solve everything.
And the U.S. has a colonial problem. They have to recognize it and they have to solve it.
Adi Martínez-Román is a lawyer with nearly 2 decades of experience in legal aid and community empowerment. She's a co-founder and co-director of Right to Democracy, a project that seeks to unite people in U.S. territories and across the U.S. mainland to dismantle and confront America's undemocratic colonial structures. She has worked in leadership roles in the Resiliency Law Center and her own nonprofit, FURIA, which focused on climate justice and advocacy training. Her career has focused on increasing access to legal services to Puerto Rico's low-income residents, and she has served as law school professor and deputy dean of students at the University of Puerto Rico Law School. She's a graduate of Princeton with a BA in Public Policy and International Affairs, a law degree from UPR Law School, and a PhD from Universidad Carlos III in Madrid. Adi, welcome to the Mano a Mano podcast. We're really excited to have you join us. Let's just get right into it. You are co-founder and co-executive director of Right to Democracy. Can you tell us a little bit about what your organization is, what your mission and approach that you're taking towards addressing the deficit of democracy that's being faced by all of the territories of the United States?
Thank you, George. Thank you, Martin, for this space. Right to Democracy was born last year after Neil Ware, my co-director, approached me with a bit of frustration that we found that we both shared after years of working with democratic deficit issues and not being able to step forth a real change that we are both seeking. So I have 20 years of experience in working with community leaders through participatory advocacy initiatives. I had created nonprofits. I had advocated in Congress and done multiple stuff trying to bring more democratic spaces, more power of local community leaders of Puerto Rico in the decision-making process of the things that affect them. And there was always this wall that when Neil called me and told me, I've been litigating for 10 years against the insular cases and we're still facing the challenges and the courts are not taking the case that we need the court to take in order to tumble this wall. And that's when it clicked for both of us that it was a good idea to get together and work the issue of self-determination in a top-down, bottom-up way. So we decided to join together and use our diverse skills to create this new organization, basically to confront and dismantle what is the colonial legal framework that keeps change from happening. And that's when we created Right to Democracy. We based our work in a very specific set of values that we both share and that we really want our work to revolve around with, beginning with respecting our differences. Neil was brought up in Guam, all his life until he went to college back to the US. And I, live in Puerto Rico. I've been here in Puerto Rico, although I went to college in the United States. And we both, we think differently about things. We don't think exactly alike, but we respect each other. We respect our desire to promote real democracy and to promote that people in the territories have a fundamental right to participate in the decision making process of things that affect them. Staying focused in our mission and how that mission can be enhanced through different initiatives, but working with self-determination, democracy, colonialism, those are big themes. So how we could stay focused in our mission of confronting and dismantling that framework was another value. Another important value was to avoid toxicity. And as you know, we are in a time where if people think differently, they usually jump to the conclusion that that is going to cancel what you are doing. So everything is seen as a zero-sum game. And this is something that has been faced by many movements. I was reading Angela Blackwell talking about the anti-racism movement and how we have to overcome the zero-sum game. So we also think that to order to build a movement to confront the legal colonial framework, we have to overcome zero-sum game mentality, avoid toxicity, and keep that as a focus of our movement. I have to say, it has been a very enriching and a complete year, that first year that we just passed, where we have been getting to know directly the people we are working for and trying to engage a multiple diversity of partners in these conversations.
I wanted to thank you for the approach that you've taken because one of the things that I had the opportunity to experience was an invitation by Right to Democracy to participate in a 2-day event in New York last year. Was the U.S. Summit on Colonialism. And that was a fantastic experience because what Right to Democracy did was you actually brought and flew in advocates from each of the 5 territories and provided us an opportunity, one, to speak to other advocates that may have different perspectives and views with regards to what we want for the political future and political status of our own territories. And that in and of itself is kind of, groundbreaking because there's so few spaces where conversations like that are supported and containers are created for fruitful conversations between people that have different perspectives, as opposed to just a debate and an automatic kind of like antagonistic approach. And then the really amazing layer was to then have the opportunity to meet folks from the other territories, to listen to their experiences, to learn about their histories, to learn about the dimensions of territorial inequality and disenfranchisement that are impacting them that we share together, but the ways in which territorial colonialism expresses itself differently depending on the historic, the legal, the cultural, and the geographic context of how it's being developed and experienced. So I would love for you to talk to us a little bit about the experience of the other U.S. territories that are subjected to territorial colonialism. Here in Mano a Mano, we obviously focus more on the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, but I think it's really important for our audience to know more about what's happening in these other territories. What are some of the similarities and differences between them? And then if you could just end up talking a little bit about how all of this work that was done at the U.S. Summit on Colonialism last year essentially brought forth the opportunity to create a cross-territorial coalition to advance democracy, equity, and self-determination in the U.S. territories.
We bet a lot in celebrating this summit on U.S. colonialism. And I have to say that it didn't start there. During the summer of last year, we had been doing a listening tour in all territories because we wanted to make sure to build our strategy around the understandings from the territories. Since the listening tour, where we started practicing with the help of El Enjambre, a Puerto Rican organization that does this type of co-creation activities. We started having 6 dialogues in Puerto Rico where people could talk about what colonialism means to them, what democracy means, what is citizenship, and we're just listening. We're just like a sponge listening. And we made sure that the groups that we formed, one of them was youth, 2 of them was low-income community leaders. We talked to people from unions. We talked from leaders of climate change work. We talked to leaders of health and elders. That was in Puerto Rico. But we made sure to have people from different ideologies, because the point of elevating our conversation and having those values of respect is to be able to talk about how do we promote change towards self-determination when we speak different languages about what the result of what that self-determination should look like. So in those dialogues in Puerto Rico, because in Puerto Rico is such a difficult issue to speak about, when we started the dialogues and we said, we don't want here to have a debate, we're just listening. This is not the place to talk about what is your thoughts about the results of self-determination. Let's talk about what it's the state of affairs now, and what do you think about what's happening now. And that kind of like, everybody was like, there was a side of relief. And when they ended the dialogue, I have to tell you, the feedback of gratefulness from all the people that participated to be able to talk about these things without having to engage in a discussion with your friend or your colleague or the person that is right beside you about statehood, independence, or free association, or anything like that. For them, they were really grateful and very relieved to be able to talk about these things without bumping heads. So that was the point for us. That's where the indications to us that we were on the right track, because we were elevating the conversation and we were able to see how there is much more common ground that we think about. So when we went to the other territories, we did 3 dialogues in Virgin Islands, 3 in Guam, 3 in Northern Mariana Islands, and we were able to do 2 in American Samoa, but those were done by American Samoa leaders. Were not done by us in respect to how they feel about democracy in American Samoa. We did all those dialogues, and it was just amazing to see that if you put, we would write everything, the notes, in these big papers. You would mix those papers in a wall. You would not be able to know where each one is from. We would do the same questions, of course. And if you would put the answers from all the places, you would not, like, there were like very slight differences, especially around the issues of militarism, which were mentioned in the Caribbean, because they were mentioned, but in the Pacific,
It's much more prevalent. It's a bigger, more present issue. Yeah.
there's actually a bomb in North Korea called the Guam Killer. So, they're in the middle of the conflict of US, Korea, US, North Korea, US, China, and they're suffering from land grabs from the military, and they're suffering from bombs testing and all that stuff. Those things were a little bit distinguishable, but other than that, it was a huge learning experience. Then we were able to bring all of you guys, after listening, we were able to then invite people to go and get together in New York in that summit. And for me, it was just fascinating to see. I remember very clearly that first morning where you had all the people starting to know each other, a lot of energy, everybody talking. And then we divided tables by territory. I don't know if you remember, Judge, that we put the Puerto Ricans, because they were too many, there were 15 of them, in another room with another table. And the other territories were chatting, and they were like, already working together. It was the exercise was to draw something related to the relationship between the territory and the US.
Yep.
And when I went to see the Puerto Rican table, everybody was really quiet. Like,
Very unlike Puerto Ricans.
I was like,
Yeah.
despierten, what is happening here? You are guys, you all know how to draw. Just pick somebody and start. And I think it's just this first apprehension of opening up in a table of people of different thoughts
Yep.
and different perspectives. And then when you guys warmed up, it came together and they started drawing. And then when you went together with the other territories, it kind of like exploded. This sense of fraternity,
Yeah.
this sense of empathy of, we are going through the very similar things. Our cultures are different, but at the same time, very similar. I don't know if you noticed how the Virgin Islanders felt. And this is, for me, one of the biggest learnings as a Puerto Rican, is that we have the Virgin Islands right there. And basically, we ignore their existence. They suffer this a lot because almost all federal programs run through Puerto Rico to go to Virgin Islands. And the first time I engaged in Virgin Islands in our lounge previous to the listening tour and in the listening tour, they were really, defensive.
Skeptical.
Like, not another Puerto Rican coming here to tell us what to do. And then just assuming an attitude of like, I'm here to learn. I'm here to listen. I'm here to really understand because I know nothing. And just assuming that attitude, they were very grateful. They knew that they had a voice and that voice was valuable. They
began contributing. Yeah.
And so it just came together so well, even when there are such big differences. I have to celebrate that we just published a report on this. So if anybody wants to see what took place, what we learned, we are publishing it today.
And Adi, that's a great segue to my next question, because Right to Democracy's advocacy efforts have led to more awareness about the discriminatory treatment that the residents of the U.S. territories experience, particularly in relation to the insular cases. I know that on April 15th, this led to a bicameral letter of, I believe it was 43 members, sending a letter to the U.S. Department of Justice, particularly Attorney General Merrick Garland, to cease the reliance of the Biden administration and the Department of Justice on the insular cases and to expressly reject them. Can you briefly explain for our listeners what the insular cases are, and also what does the letter specifically request? And is there currently a case that is ripe for the Supreme Court to address this issue?
Okay, so the insular cases are a series of cases solved by the U.S. Supreme Court between 1901 and 1922, around that. There's differences, different ideas of which cases are. It's around 17 cases. And these cases basically establish a doctrine. For those that are not lawyers, what that word means is that it defines the concepts.
It's a framework. Yeah.
The framework, that's what we call the legal framework, colonial framework, that still affects territories today. So when the United States decided as a country to expand further than their territorial borders
of the continental United States,
the continental United States. So they, in the turn of the century, while the Spanish American Cuban War was happening, there was all these political discussions in the US whether they could acquire these insular areas, and that's why it's the insular cases. So they did. And after the Spanish American Cuban War, they acquired Puerto Rico, they acquired Guam, and the Philippines. And the Philippines went to war with the United States for their independence, but some disputes started happening. These cases that got to the Supreme Court almost all have to do with taxes, like when you are doing business and how you should tax products. The first two cases were about this. And these cases solved the question of whether in these new insular areas the Constitution would apply directly or automatically. And here is where the court created these concepts, this doctrine of territorial incorporation. And they said that there are already some territories in the United States, but these new territories are different. And they are different. And the main reason was because they have savages, uncivilized people, and that they are not capable of being part of the US democratic political body.
The
And that,
Anglo-Saxon forms of government, quote unquote.
yes, quote unquote, literally. And that therefore, Congress had not expressed the will to incorporate these into our political body, their political body, and that it could happen because they were, in that sense, unincorporated. And then that they could be ruled through the territorial clause with plenary powers of Congress as Congress seemed fit. So therefore, stamping a very big seal of approval in terms of, because this is the role of the courts. The role of the courts is not to establish public policy, but it is to evaluate if the actions of the executive and the legislative are constitutional. So what they are saying is what you are doing is constitutional and you can keep doing it until you see fit. And this is the same court, George and Martin, that solved the cases of Plessy versus Ferguson, which established separate but equal. So these were 9 judges, almost all of them very racist, white men, that established this difference of you are inferior, we are superior, and you belong to us, but you're not part of us.
One of the best summaries of that I've ever heard is the characterization of them. So if Plessy v. Ferguson was justifying that it was okay to be separate as long as things were equal, and then ultimately Brown v. Board of Education said, no, separate is inherently unequal, right? In the case of the insular cases, it's that you are both separate and unequal, right?
Definitely separate because you're unequal.
Yeah.
And so when it establishes this doctrine, it approves, it legitimizes. And this is where I insist, and I learned this from the great professor Efren Rivera Ramos in his book, if people haven't read it, The Legal Construction of Identity.
Fantastic.
Where he identifies how legal doctrine, how legal decisions affect everyday culture, because you are legitimizing colonialism, and this is what is lived by, and this is what is absorbed in culture. What we say in Right to Democracy is that these cases establish this legal colonial framework that then creates this insidiousness. Not only affects territories and territorial government, but it also affects the way that the US, its legislators, its public administrators view their role in government, and legitimizes attitudes of we are authorized to govern unilaterally over the lives of these people. And many times you see it, you feel it, and this is what I felt when I went to advocate over there, is this insidiousness you feel it as paternalism, you feel it as feelings of superiority and of saying these people don't know what they're doing, we're going to solve everything. So it is an insidious attitude that permeates everything, and that's why we insist on confronting that attitude by saying this is definitely and should not be part of the constitutional law of the US. It goes against the principal values of the founding of the United States, and it goes against the international principles that the United States is part of, which require self-determination as one of the fundamental values of democratic government.
One of the things that we talk about a lot here on Mano a Mano and in general in the work that Martin and I do is addressing the issue of territorial colonialism in the case of Puerto Rico, but also in the case of the other territories, is fundamental not just to help improve the living conditions of the people in the territories, which are right now being treated unequally and therefore don't have the same opportunities or the same rights as their fellow citizens stateside, but it's also fundamental so that America can actually live up to its founding values of government by consent of the governed, of equality under the law. You can't have these things in your Declaration of Independence. You can't post them over the lintel of the Supreme Court building and then have the asterisks there. Oh, except you're in a U.S. territory, right?
Also, something else that we add to that, George, is that this insidiousness, like you say, unilateral governance is always extractive. When other colleagues, economists say that colonialism is an extractive economy, is because that is the result of having, it's kind of like unavoidable. That's why democracy is so important, because you need participation in order for the results of the production of policies and stuff are actually shared by all those that participate in the system, right? That's like the logic of democracy. So definitely there is that problem of being extractive, how it affects and renders the economies impossible to develop positively for the people of these places. But there's also the fact that, as I say, that insidiousness of governance in the United States is reflected even in the minorities of the US. So we argue that this issue with the territories is so important because recognizing the insidiousness of this colonialism has to be part of the movement within the United States to recognize sometimes the insidiousness of governance over some of minorities. Because you have many people in the US, I've heard people from Louisiana, people from Texas, people from Hawaii, denouncing the colonial character or the colonial nature of government action. And you're like, oh my God, they're talking about, but they don't even know or realize it's because you guys have real colonies. Like, as we speak, this is not just a style, it is actually a matter of fact existence, and how that kind of perverses or permeates the lack of democratic effectiveness within the United States.
And Adi, is there currently a case that is ripe for the Supreme Court to address this issue? And another question on that. One issue that has become of concern to some people is that, especially in Puerto Rico, that if the insular cases were to be overturned by the Supreme Court, that Puerto Rico would automatically become an incorporated territory. If the Supreme Court were to reject the insular cases, would Puerto Rico become an automatic incorporated territory, or would the court develop a new test? And what's the best case scenario under that hopeful new test?
Or the worst?
Okay.
We can do both.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so first, the first part of the question. Currently, there is not a ripe case right now. There has been several opportunities. The Supreme Court usually expresses itself on these issues when it wants to sustain the power of the US over the territories. When there is a ripe issue, we have not yet seen when there is a ripe issue to actually reject the framework, it hasn't taken it into the attention. I think now, for example, the last thing we saw was I think a month ago or a little bit more ago. There is a case, and it is the case of the Promesa law of the UTIER, where the lawyers are arguing the unconstitutionality of Promesa, and the arguments of the Department of Justice. It has advanced a little bit, the argument, by saying there are very regretful or rejectable elements to the insular cases, but they don't, they are not, this is not the issue here.
So they've avoided addressing it, basically.
Yeah, they always avoid addressing it, but then it begs the question of, if there are rejectable aspects of the cases, what are the acceptable aspects of the cases? Because definitely the legal colonial framework is very problematic, right? So that's where this letter comes to show the consensus that we have been able to sum
Develop.
up,
Yeah.
to develop, yes, because you have 23 representatives, 15 senators, I think it was 28 representatives and 15 senators that were actually, no, you have to reject the cases completely and not use this doctrine to emphasize about the power of the U.S. over the territories. It is not proper. It should not be a constitutional thing. And we think it's a good opportunity to do this right now. There are Supreme Court justices from very conservative background, like Gorsuch, that he rejects the doctrine, and he mentions this in his expressions in Bayo. It was in Bayo Madero, where he said that the insular cases are American colonialism, and they should not be part of the doctrines of the U.S. or part of constitutional law. The same thing, of course, we have Sonia Sotomayor from the liberal spectrum rejecting the insular cases. So this is an issue that is very clear and is able to bring consensus between ideology. That does not guarantee that if this case from the UTIER reaches the Supreme Court, which we don't know if it will, if they will have the will to take on and interpret Promesa on the light of its constitutionality of the insular case doctrine. Now to the second part of the question, Martin. Why do we insist on doing this, on confronting or using the legal doctrine created by the insular cases to confront this colonial framework? It is a strategy. It is a strategy that recognizes that law and politics are not separated by this wall of theory. Because this is the thing, when I'm a law professor, and sometimes academia and law professors and any professor, it starts, with in the realms of the ideas, thinking about what will happen, what will not happen. At the end, there is always a political character to what law is. So it is very difficult to predict anything. Yet, under the doctrine and under what you want, we can understand what law is. The role of the Supreme Court is to interpret the constitutionality of things. Their role is not to create new policy. So what they do in the insular cases is tell us this, that the U.S. is doing, that Congress is doing, is constitutional because, and then they create the doctrine of incorporation. So if we revoke the insular cases, we will eliminate the doctrine of incorporation as a constitutionally valid way of thinking of congressional action, but still it will not change the fact that we are a territory,
Yeah.
and that we remain a territory.
Yeah.
It's not going to automatically fall back into incorporation or non-incorporation, because first, those concepts are going to be declared unconstitutional, but also because in any case, it will require an act of Congress, because the court cannot do public policy. The court can say if it's constitutional or not, but the ones that are going to decide what will happen next is Congress. And this is where we emphasize confronting the insular cases is a strategy, but also is backed with the strategy of building a movement of all these people that are looking for change to present what is self-determination, what self-determination should look like, and what is the responsibility of US Congress to act in ways that actually respond to their constitutional obligations. That's what the Supreme Court can establish, but also their international obligations, because they're there. So basically, that we don't think it's going to automatically incorporate us. I think that is a framework that worked back then when the US was doing what it was doing. But right now, and looking at the political spectrum right now, and I have to say this, if Congress wanted to incorporate us, they would have done it already. Nothing impedes that right now. And if they wanted us to let us go, they would have done that already, and that does not change with the insular cases.
So, Ali, I think what the explanation you provided was incredibly helpful, not just in terms of helping us understand the strategy and approach that Right to Democracy is taking, but also about this reality that the efforts to address the insular cases and have both the Department of Justice and the Supreme Court reject them are in and of themselves part of a process of raising awareness and consciousness about the need to have Congress, which has ultimate power over this issue, take action. And I think it's really important for our audience to be aware that if you remove the concept of territorial incorporation that was developed through the insular cases, Congress still has the plenary powers that are afforded to it under the Constitution, which literally say Congress shall have the power to establish all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory. And that means that Congress can still continue to discriminate against Puerto Rico and the other territories, can still continue to treat us unequally, and also that Puerto Rico and the other territories are still going to be disenfranchised, because under the U.S. constitutional framework, only states have the full capacity to allow for democratic representation through electing members to the Senate, electing members to the House, and then ultimately having representation in the Electoral College. That's kind of a perfect segue to talk about maybe one of the places where the work of Right to Democracy intersects a little bit with the work that we've been doing in the Puerto Rico Statehood Council, which is you guys are working on helping to raise awareness about the broader issue and using the insular cases as the methodology of kind of getting both the executive branch and the legislative branch to recognize that there's a need to take action on it. In our side, we've been very much focused on the direct route approach of actually engaging Congress directly in developing legislation that addresses this issue. And part of the work that we take a lot of pride in having participated in is in helping to support the Puerto Rico statehood movement to kind of overcome its own ideas about just pushing for our status option and really coming to the table to, negotiate this compromise legislation, which is a process that happened in 2021 and 2022 and ultimately led to the House passage of a legislation called the Puerto Rico Status Act, which doesn't take sides with regards to whether Puerto Rico's ultimate status should be statehood, independence, or free association. It just says colonialism's wrong. Congress has the responsibility to address this, and we should actually allow the people in the territories to make their own decision about what they want for their future, and then Congress should provide a mechanism for that to be implemented. So, that's really what we've been working on. There are aspects of the bill which are not perfect from our perspective. I know that there's aspects of the bill that you may not necessarily agree with 100%, but we'd love to hear a little bit about your perspective about that legislation and whether that legislation can serve as both a vehicle to kind of help advance the legislative process, so that there's something, ready there for when that kind of threshold of awareness arises within the federal executive and legislative for the need to take action on it.
So, as I established in the introduction, right to democracy approach to confronting the legal framework, the legal colonial framework, always distances itself from any type of solution in terms of results of self-determination. So we are not saying, or we don't pretend to say, whether statehood or independence or free association or what result would be best for after processes of self-determination.
For any of the territories, yeah.
For any of the territories, and this is very important. For any of the territories, thank you for bringing that, because each territory has its situation, its political challenges that are different.
Yep.
And that is one of the things that we as Puerto Ricans should kind of like remember when we are doing stuff for ourselves, that what we do, because we are the most populated and we have a lot of people in the US, so there is some
or the most politically powerful territory. Yeah.
Yes. That it really affects the other territories. So that's why we emphasize in the cross-territorial approach to this. So when we look at the Puerto Rico Status Act, it is a very it is a different than before approach.
Yep.
Where you have people of different ideologies coming together, and we can attribute how far it has gone to being able to sit down together with people that are different to be able to push this. Like, this is something that is that definitely distinguishes this approach from other approaches before. And I think it has gotten as far as it has because of this new lens that you guys promote and other of the people that participate promote of sitting down, negotiating, and talking.
Imagine
but
that.
yes. But we do see that engagement should be further,
Yeah.
especially in the territories, because again, sometimes we feel, or sometimes we, because of the political fraud in Washington, because how things cook in the political scene,
the sausage making process of making laws.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good word. The sausage making process, not having those deep engagements in the territories about their challenges, their needs, what this means to them, how this is developed. It's something that might enrich it even more. It's something that it needs to be done to enrich these processes. And this is what we've learned, I tell you, George, from this year of building a strategy by going and listening to all the territories. It has been enriching the process that we are building, and building a movement of consensus that is even more powerful. And this is something that I've learned throughout my career as a community advocate. It's not coming into a strategy knowing or believing that my solution to that strategy is the best one. Is how do we build a strategy together that always has proven to be the best way of doing it. So yes, further engagement in the territories is a must. But what we see and we emphasize in Right to Democracy is that the reason why things have not changed, the main reason of why things has not changed, is not because the people in the territories or our supporters have not tried to change them. We have been fighting against this colonial framework for 125 years.
That's
Well,
right.
not to count the Spanish colonial framework, but the one that is responsibility of the US.
Yep.
We have been, and there has been different attempts to do it, and it's not because of Puerto Ricans, as many times they make us feel
Yeah.
when we go to Congress and they say, oh, you guys don't decide yourself.
And
Oh,
you haven't
guys,
done enough, and you should need
you
to
haven't
educate
done
us
enough.
more. And
Yes, it is. And we're like, wait. There is a step that we emphasize for local attempts or attempts to change this, to move forward, and that is the reckoning. And we say the reckoning because there is this, and I can say that is a sort of a hypocrisy
yeah,
that underlines the governance, where you have the one that is responsible for changing it cleaning their hands
and putting the blame on the one who is subjected to the policies that are,
Yes. And this is why I always repeat that an addict is not able to break with an addiction until he recognizes, or she recognizes, they recognize that there is a problem to begin with. And so that first step is a very important step that needs to happen in order to move the political insidiousness that serves as a wall for these attempts to move forward. And I would have to add that that's why also we elevate the conversation cross-territorially. I don't know, George and Martin, maybe you guys know because you are very involved in Washington, that the Virgin Islands attempted last summer to get a constitution. They don't have a constitution. And they attempted to Congress to have a constitution, and Congress said no because they didn't like it. And again, this is like us in 1952 when we presented a constitution and they edited it. But we in Puerto Rico, we're here. We're doing the Puerto Rico Status Act. We're doing all that stuff, and we don't even know that our brothers and sisters of the Virgin Islands are
just a
trying
few
to
miles away,
just a few miles, 15-minute flight.
Plane ride, yeah.
A plane ride. They're closest. St. Croix is closest to Vieques than Vieques is to Puerto Rico.
Yep.
And so to the main island. Let me correct that. And so we are the same archipelago. We have the same Taino roots.
Mhm.
We have the same African, tribes that were brought to the Caribbean. So we are a family, but we are not conscious of each other. And I think that leaders, and I have to say, Stacey Plaskett, I don't know if you've seen the press conference, how she was there calling things by their name and calling people by their name about the need for them to recognize of the need to change this colonial framework, and how much power that brings when you kind of like elevate and say this is not only a thing of Puerto Ricans, this is a thing of Virgin Islanders and Asian Pacific islands that are suffering this conundrum.
And just to kind of wrap things up now, I think one of the things that we can take away from this conversation is the power of raising awareness about the issue so that it's clear the need to address it and to take action. I think we can take as a takeaway the important opportunities of taking different approaches to address the issue and how those approaches can be complementary. And we can find ways for people with different views and different perspectives to at least agree on creating space for dialogue on how to solve the issues and figure out processes that make sense, even if the ultimate visions of what we want for the political future of each of our territories is different. And I think the other piece that I would say is that this is not just an issue of Puerto Rico and the territories. These are issues that impact U.S. national security because they address the way the United States is dealing with its relationship with China and North Korea and other places in the Pacific, as well as the influence of other governments in the Caribbean. It's an issue that has to deal with economic realities and interstate commerce and international trade. It's an issue that has to deal with how we're represented in front of the international community, where we've made some commitments and not always lived up to them. And it's an issue that also fundamentally deals with whether America is really willing to live up to its core values and the best parts of what our country is about. So with that, I would invite you to share with us how people can find out more information about you and your organization.
Sure. So definitely the easiest way is through social media. You can find us in LinkedIn. You can find us in Instagram, Facebook. I think X also, but I'm not that of an X person. And you find us at right to the number 2 democracy at right to the number 2 democracy.
.us.
And well, that is the handle for social media. And then our webpage is right to democracy, to the whole words together. So no number 2, right to democracy.us. And that's our webpage. In there, you can find a lot of information of what we're doing and all the blogs that we've done, the interviews. We have done interterritorial dialogues too that are very interesting, always having a guest from each territory. We've done more than 5 already. So just go in and explore, and you can write to us directly for more information.
Excellent, Adi. Well, thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. We look forward to continuing to collaborate as part of the Cross-Territorial Coalition. And we may have different approaches and different perspectives about the future of Puerto Rico, but I think we share love for the island and a deep respect for the people in the territory, in Puerto Rico, and across all the territories. So thank you for everything that you're doing to support us.
Thank you, George and Martin.